Hello, I'm Tim Smith with the Adams County Historical Society, and welcome to part 2 of Where Were Smith's Guns? So here we're at the rear section of Captain James Smith's battery, positioned in the Valley of Death, just a little north of Devil's Den. And of course, you know, Smith's battery being located at the left flank of General Sickles' advanced position, you know, this section was actually guarding the Plum Run Gorge, the rear of the 3rd Army Corps on July 2nd. And, you know, it's interesting, of course, today, you know, when we read back on it, we know that the 5th Army Corps will arrive, occupy Little Round Top, and, of course, form a new left flank of the Army of the Potomac. But at the time that the 3rd Army Corps had moved to Devil's Den and Smith's guns went into position, this was the left flank of the Army of the Potomac. And when the Southern Army attacked and came up and over Big Round Top and into the Plum Run Valley, they well outflanked General Sickles' men here in their advanced position. This marker was placed here in July 1900, and the guns for the rear section were placed here sometime shortly after. It's interesting that this at the time that this plaque was placed at this location, Captain Smith had died. I believe Henry Hunt was dead. There was no John Batchelder anymore. He had died. And there is no doubt that this marker is placed incorrectly. It is approximately 320 yards from this marker to the crest of Devil's Den, and maybe you can look up and see the monument to the 99th Pennsylvania we talked about up on top of the hill. In Captain James Smith's official report of the battle, written just a few days after the fighting, he said that the rear section was 150 yards in the rear of his advanced section. And years later, in 1886, when he published his history of the 4th New York Independent Battery, he said that the rear section was only 75 yards in rear of his advanced section. Now, some of you might be like, well, you know, it's not that much of a difference. Captain Smith is an artilleryman. On a regular basis, he judges distances so he can cut the fuses on his shells and locate his artillery properly. Artillerymen know how far something is away. So if he says it's 75 yards to 150 yards, it just can't be 320 yards away. It just doesn't make any sense. And there's a couple interesting things about this. For instance, when the 6th New Jersey wheel into position, they cut off the fire of Smith's guns across the valley. And you can see the 6th New Jersey monument up there. And also, there is a rarely visited marker that we are going to check out right now, and that is a flank marker for Smith's New York Independent Battery that is located over here in this swale. I don't want to point exactly where it is because of course you know that you have to find it, and I'm not going to tell you exactly where it is because it'll spoil the fun. So right now you're looking back at where the Gettysburg National Military Park Commission, run by the War Department, placed the rear of Smith's guns. Now, but according to all the information we have about the location of Smith's rear section from the 4th New York Independent Battery, it was over here somewhere where we're located. In a second you'll see me. And according to Captain Smith, he occupied a hillock more in rear, and from that position raked the Plum Run Gorge. And one thing is interesting is in the opening of the battle, Captain Smith himself is up on top of the rocks of Devil's Den, firing out across the west to Seminary Ridge. And once the 124th New York charged down the hill into the valley below, then Captain Smith leaves his guns on top. They actually drew one of the guns off that had been disabled, but 3 of the guns ended up being captured by the Southern Army and ended up being taken with the Southern Army after they left the battle. But Smith and his men took all the implements from the 3 guns that were left on the crest of the ridge, came back to the rear section where he provided valuable service for a few minutes, firing across into the attack of the Southern Army that was charging through the woods and starting their assault on Little Round Top into the Texans on the side of the hill. You can see what a really nice field of fire there is against the area of attack on Little Round Top. But he wasn't in position here long before the 6th New Jersey of Burling's brigade arrived as reinforcements, and they charged into the area and blocked Smith's line of fire. And that's again another one of the clues that the guns were not back there along the road. The key is that when you put in these avenues, they had a tendency to want to put the markers and monuments right next to the avenue, not worrying about the exact placement of the markers to designate the exact placement of the thing that they were marking in the first place. But here it is. Here's a marker, and let me just tell you this. It is really difficult to find this location in the summer. So again, for this particular marker, I want everyone to wait until it's the summer and then try to come out here and fight your way through the brambles and the sticker bushes and find this location. And this is the right flank marker, it says, of Smith's guns. So this is the right flank marker, and of course the left flank marker is up there on top of the rocks of Devil's Den. So it's fascinating to find this location. And I think prior to my understanding of the battle here at Devil's Den, friends of mine who were already tour guides or historians had led me to believe that this marker was placed to indicate the spot where the limber chest or the caissons of Smith's battery was located and not the rear section. But over the years I've come to believe that this location, or perhaps the little hill where the camera is actually the position of the rear section. And again, it's one of the rarely visited monuments on the field. One other thing, there's an interesting photograph taken by Matthew Brady and his crew from the summit of Little Round Top a week after the battle, looking in this direction. And I'll try to put the best version of it I have here, but under magnification, you can see tracks of wagons, theoretically, caissons and limbers along the side of this hill here, undoubtedly on the path of where Captain Smith got his guns into position and got his guns out of position. Another story we like to tell here, and I should have put the exact story reference in here, but General Henry Hunt, who had visited Captain Smith and helped him get his guns into position on July 2nd. After this, he rode down across this valley to get back to his headquarters. And when he was coming through the valley, Confederate artillery had opened fire, and there was a herd of cattle in the valley. Perhaps a herd of cattle that was hidden in the valley by local Gettysburg people so that to avoid them being captured by one of the armies. And Captain Smith, or I should say General Henry Hunt, said that his worst and scariest experience during the entire battle was trying to get through this cattle that was going crazy because of the artillery shells bursting around him, and that he feared for his life at this moment. One last thing at this location is I mentioned several times that Captain James Smith wrote a book in 1886 about his experiences during the Civil War. And some of the things he wrote in the book are slightly exaggerated. For instance, he says that from the time he left the top of the hill and came to this rear section, and the Union infantry left the summit of that hill, which is not true, he said it was 40 minutes before he was relieved. And I guess he's talking about the 6th New Jersey coming on. It couldn't, to me, it couldn't have been more than 5 or 10 minutes that he was at this location. And while he's at this location, there's still heavy fighting on top of the crest of the hill with the other units of the 3rd Corps. But he says, 40 minutes elapsed between the departure of the infantry from the ridge and the arrival of the 2 regiments positioned in rear of it. Every one of those minutes contained 60 seconds. And into each of those seconds was crowded a lifetime. An interesting aspect of this monument is the fact that there's a rock carving associated with it. And, you know, this stuff is fascinating to me. It says here, P. Noel. Now, it looks like Noel, but locally, that name is pronounced Noel. And, you know, I remember when I was younger, and I'd always known tour guides, that someone showed it to me. And no one seemed to know much about it. And one of our guides, he was doing a tour for a group who asked him to do some ghost stories. I remember this tour guide, he's not into ghost stories, but he did it. And he did a bunch of ghost stories along the area of Devil's Den through the wheat field. And then at the end, he would tell them that none of these stories were true and he just made them all up. And he seemed to get a big kick out of it. But one of the stories that he made up specifically for this Halloween walking tour was Paulina Noel. And the story he told was something like a farmer was taking his daughter across this area in a wagon prior to the Civil War, and a rattlesnake came out, and a horse jumped and ran and threw the girl out of the wagon, and Paulina landed on the ground, and then the wagon wheel rolled across her neck and decapitated her. And later that night, with a fiery finger of hell, she came back and carved her name in this rock. And, you know, I remember him telling this story to the guides that he made up, and we all thought it was really interesting. But someone on that tour told someone else, who I imagine told someone else, and then this tour got in a ghost tour book called Haunted Gettysburg, I remember. And so a lot of people read that ghost book, and people believe this story. And you know, no one named Paulina Noel ever lived or died in this area. So one of the guides challenged me to figure out who this rock carving, you know, who did this rock carving and why. And at that time I was working at the Adams County Historical Society. This may have been like 35 years ago. And I was a volunteer then at the time. And so what I did is I went to our obituary index. And how they had the index, and we have 250,000 index cards, is they had it by alphabetical order by last name. So I went to the Knowles, and I got all the P. Knowles out, and I looked at every person named P. Knoll. And I don't know exactly what I was looking for. But then I started to review some of these people that seemed like possible candidates and look at their obituaries. And I came across this guy, Park Knoll. He lived in town on Middle Street for a while. I think he was born out on the Baltimore Pike, and then eventually lived on Mummersburg Street. And he was a stonemason in his early life. And it said specifically in his obituary that for a time he worked with a company erecting monuments around the battlefield. And you know what's really interesting, these monuments, when they're sent to Gettysburg, like the 4th New York Independent Battery, are sent in pieces. And it's a local company that actually puts the monument together. And if you look at the base of the 4th New York, it's not the same kind of stone as the upper part of the monument. It's made out of that Gettysburg granite, which is this local rock. And the flank markers are not made out of the same stone as the monument. They were made out of local rocks, Gettysburg granite. And this one is actually carved the left flank of the 4th New York Artillery. But this marker says 4th Battery, New York Artillery, left flank. It's initials. And my conjecture, and again, this is conjecture, is that this guy, Park Knoll, worked for this company, placing this monument. And the base of it's made out of that. This is made out of local granite. He probably carved the inscription on this rock and then came over here and carved his name on this rock. It's done very professionally. This is no haphazard rock carving like many on the battlefield.